Today, at 819 Northwest 2nd Avenue in Miami's Overtown, stands the Black Archives and Lyric Theater. In the heyday of Overtown, this was simply the Lyric Theater, central to the bustling nightlife of what was then Little Broadway. The Lyric has had several reinventions in its more than 100 years of existence, but the credit for why it still stands today belongs to Dr. Dorothy Jenkins Fields. The Lyric is just one of the contributions that Dr. Fields has made to her community in the preservation of Black Miami history and culture. Dr. Fields is just one member of a family of trailblazers from Miami's Overtown, and as such her path to historic preservation was not a clear-cut one.
When I was in high school, my stepfather, James McKellar, used to say to me, you know, you're always talking and you have a good story to tell. You should be a lawyer. And that used to aggravate me because there were no women black lawyers in Miami. When I was growing up, I didn't know that a black woman could become a lawyer. Gwen Cherry was then a math teacher at Miami Northwestern when she decided to go to law school. So it's very exciting now to see the black women lawyers and to know that one of my daughters, Catherine, is a lawyer.
The moment that changed Dr. Fields' life and the Black community when it came to Black history and preservation happened in 1974.
I was a school librarian at Myrtle Grove Elementary School. It was all white at the time. It's located, of course, in Opelika. And I was preparing for the bicentennial in 1974. On TV and in the newspaper and the magazines, they were all saying everybody should participate. And I thought it would be good for the children at this school, since it was all white, to learn something about Black history. I didn't know that much. I knew my parents and grandparents had been here for a while, but I didn't know how long. I knew there were no books in my library, but certainly I thought that some books had been written and the downtown library would have them. And so it was very hard because I had two babies, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old at the time, and my then husband was a full-time law student at the University of Miami, so I had no extra time. But whenever I could, I would go downtown and pick up books for the teachers who were working on certain projects. And so preparing in February of 1974, I did not want to have to go downtown, take the girls. So I called the library, the downtown county library, expecting to get 15 or 20 books on Blacks in Miami. I called and she put me on hold. And then she came back and she said, I told her what I was looking for. She said, we don't have any books about Black people. We only have a folder with obituaries. And I gasped. And I asked, why? And the answer she gave changed my life and the life of the entire community as it relates to Black history. And her answer was, I guess those people haven't thought enough of themselves to write their history. I could not imagine that anyone would think that. But this person at the library said it without malice. She just said it as a matter of fact. But I would not accept that. So I asked again, I said, well, somebody must have Black history. And she said, well, why don't you call the Historical Museum of Southern Florida? I said, what's that? Because I'd never heard of it. And she answered by saying, well, all the 4th grade children go there every year. I said, well, I was in 4th grade at Phyllis Wheatley and we didn't go. And I could see her just shrugging her shoulders as if to say that wasn't her fault. So she gave me the phone number, and I immediately called, and the person who answered was Dr. Thelma Peters. And she explained that she was a retired teacher from Edison Senior High School, and that she had retired and gone to the University of Florida and earned a PhD in history. And she was now a volunteer at the Historical Museum, and that she was writing a book on Lemon City, now known as Little Haiti. And she had interviewed some black people, and she'd gotten some pictures, but no one seemed interested beyond that. Second time I'd heard that day. She also told me about her colleague, Arva Moore Parks, who was the new president of the Historical Museum of Southern Florida, and that Arva was working on a book on the history of Coconut Grove. And she too had done some interviews, and she'd collected some pictures, but no one was interested beyond that. So I said, well, I'm interested. In fact, I know a family of 7, all of whom finished high school and college and returned to Miami before the end of World War II. And Dr. Peters said, oh no, there's no family like that. I said, yes. It took me a while to convince her, and finally I said, it's my mother and her family. And then she became very interested. She said, oh yes, well, is that so? Well, I would like to interview them. And so it was Memorial Day of 1974 that I convinced them. Uncle John was in court. Uncle Fred was doing real estate. Uncle Ken was delivering a baby. So my mother, Aunt Elaine, and Aunt Roberta, and Uncle Sammy said they would go with me. We got in the car knowing that I am geographically challenged, and they said, where are we going and what's the address? I said, we're going to a building across from Vizcaya, same building as the Museum of Science. That's where the History Museum was at that time. And I said, please, just get in the car. I don't want to hear any stories. Because they were always telling stories, you know, coming in and out, talking to my grandmother, just talking to each other, just stories, 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 all the time. And so, getting in the car, my uncle looked at the address and he said, oh, Vizcaya, that's where Papa started planting the flowers. He helped till the soil. He helped with the bricks and all of that at the beginning of the building of Vizcaya. I said, I didn't want to hear any stories, but of course I heard the story, and I was happy that I did, because that connected me. That was the connection that I didn't know that I had. I learned later too that my grandfather also worked for Williams Jennings Bryan. So it must have been in 1910, 1911, 1912. Williams Jennings Bryan was living in Coral Gables and going back and forth. He was running for president of the United States. He was also helping George Merrick to promote Coral Gables. And so my grandfather was a handyman. I'm sure there may have been several, but he was one of them. My grandfather, being the Bahamian man that he was at work one day when Mr. Bryan, William Jennings Bryan, was out of town. And Mrs. Bryan must have called my grandfather to the door to give him some instructions. And when he finished, my grandfather said, I won't be able to do those things because I don't take orders from a woman. Now you know what my grandmother must have said when he got home. with those, they said those 7-headed children. Lost his job.
Talking to Dr. Peters and hearing her family stories again sparked an interest in Dorothy to preserve as much of these stories as she could find for the bicentennial anniversary.
So I did write a grant to Third Century, which was the county organization for the bicentennial. And the only other project that had been submitted was by Mrs. Eunice Liberty from the National Council of Negro Women, and hers was called Trash Bash, picking up trash in Liberty City and Overtown. So here I presented this on an academic level, talking about starting a photographic archives. So they looked at it, they said, well, this is a good idea. Who do you work for? I said, Dade County Public Schools. So they said, well, this is something the school system should do. So I remember my response, you know the school system is not going to do this. This is 1974 now. So they said, well, you never know. Why don't you try? So I didn't even know who to go to. But I did mention it to a friend of our family's, Edna DeVoe. And when I mentioned to her, she said, oh, well, a friend of mine wants to write a book about women for the bicentennial, and maybe you two should get together. Her name is Ruth Braddock, and her husband is chairman of the school board. So Edna DeVoe mentioned it to Ruth Braddock. So Ruth said, well, let me talk with Holmes about it and see if we can't get you reassigned. Would you be willing to be a social studies teacher? Yes. Would you be willing to 1 day a week do research on women? That was for Ruth's book. 1 day a week do research on women. That was for my book. 2 days a week you will develop curriculum, and 1 day a week you will go to any school that calls you from Homestead to Oges. Will you do that? Oh yes, I'll do that. I didn't know what it meant. But if it was going to give me an opportunity to do something about Black history and to make it available to school children, I accepted it.
The school board voted and approved Dorothy's new position. But when she showed up for work, she was told there was no room for her there. So she was assigned to the Historical Museum of Southern Florida.
So I was assigned. And that's where the Block Archives started, up in the attic at the Historical Museum across from Vizcaya, and they told me that in the attic next to my desk were nitrate negatives that could explode at any time. So they said, we hope you're not a smoker. So that's how I started. So I was fascinated, and I had never heard of all of this. And after about 2 weeks, I realized that I was there for a purpose.
Dorothy's assignment in archival work required that she complete several coursework in archival administration and also training in historical preservation. She went to Emory University to complete the courses.
My mother and my girls went with me. That's another story about Black teachers going to graduate school and not being able to go to graduate school in the state of Florida and having to go out of the state of Florida, paid teachers to go out. not just Florida, but all over the South. And so my mother, whenever my mother went to graduate school, she took me. She never got a master's, but we had fun going to different schools because the state paid for it. When I read about archives administration and went to Emory University for the Georgia State Archives Institute, a part of the curriculum was historic preservation. And I had never heard of the term before. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I became excited about it and learned as much as I could about historic preservation. And so that was the summer of 1977. I got back to Miami. When I got back in August of '77, one of the first articles that I read in the Miami News was that the school system was going to tear down Booker T. Washington High School. And I thought, oh no, they can't do that. And I just learned about historic preservation. And I mentioned it to my uncle. He said, oh no, you can't let them do that. I'm like, not me. I don't even know. I mean, I know the Chapmans, but I don't. He said, you can't let them tear it down. They want to make a parking lot out of it, tear it down and make a parking lot out of that space.
On the campus of Booker T. Washington High School was the Chapman House.
The school board had already bought the property, and so they owned it. And I was able to get money from the state of Florida to restore the Chapman House and to really make it a center for the children at Booker T. It was not an easy thing because the school system really thought that I was double dipping with working, trying to save things. Thanks to Dr. Barbara Carey Schuler, who was on the county commission at the time. In the 70s, she appointed me to the newly established Historic Preservation Board. And that's where I learned about historic preservation, really. It was one thing to learn at Emory, but it was another thing to actually see the practical application of it. And we were able to get the Chapman House saved and restored, and for some time have a program there. Dr. Chapman was one of the early doctors. My uncle, Dr. S.H. Johnson, was his physician. But Dr. William Chapman Sr. was a medical doctor. His office was on 8th Street, where the parking lot of Bethel is now, between Bethel and that grocery store. That was his first office. And later he built a home, 12th Street and 6th Avenue, and that home was built before the school, before Booker T. Washington High School was built. And at the home that he built, he incorporated his office. Dr. Chapman worked for the state. Once he closed his practice in his home, he was hired to work statewide to assist blacks with communicable diseases. That was a very important job that he did for the state of Florida. I was determined to save as many of the historic structures as possible in Overtown and in other black neighborhoods too, because those properties show, first of all, ownership for the most part of blacks, and provided an opportunity to show the character of the area and helped it to be a community. And so it was not just the Chapman House, but I was the one who started the historic preservation movement for blacks in Dade County. Since then, there's a district in Richmond Heights that's been saved, and other properties throughout the county. A year or two later, I took a group on a tour to see what, if any, historic properties were damaged by the 1980 riots. And we were surprised and delighted to see that the churches were still intact and that other historic sites were also. Got to the Lyric Theater. Garth Reeves was the one who said, "Let's stop here." Got to the Lyric Theater, we all got out. At that time, the Lyric Theater did not have a roof on it. It was in so very bad shape. Pigeons were flying in and out. The homeless were in there defecating in it. And people say, "Where are the pictures?" Of course, we're talking now about 1980. And you know, when you took a picture then with your Brownie Hawkeye camera, you'd have to take it to Walgreens and Eckert, and it would take 2 weeks for them to develop it. Nothing like it is now. So we really don't have any pictures, except in my mind. At that time, it was owned by a church, and they had abandoned it. And so I asked Sonny Wright about it. So he said, "Oh yeah, they'll get it." I said, "Well, we want them to donate it." He said, "Well, no, you know, nobody's going to donate it." So it sat for a while, but it had a sign on it. I wish I had taken a picture. The sign said it was going to be condemned. So I mentioned it to Uncle Sammy. He said, "Oh no, you can't let them." I said, "Now you got me in trouble with the Chapman house. I can't, what can I do?" So he said, "Well, let's find out who owns it and see what you can do. But you can't, because Mr. Jeter Walker built it." That's when I was told that a black man built it, and that my uncle saw it being built and what these people had done. And so it had to be saved. And it was then that I was able to get the city of Miami not to tear it down, but to donate it to the Black Archives. When my uncle, Dr. S.H. Johnson, was growing up, he was born in Key West in 1900, and the family moved to Miami in 1903. So he was actually 13 years old when the Lyric was being built. Because our family lived just 2 blocks north of the Lyric at that time, he said that he would go by the Lyric quite often and watch the building being constructed. Often he would see Mr. Jeter Walker, the black man whose idea it was to build the Lyric Theater. I didn't remember the Lyric Theater. When we moved, I was going to first grade, and when we would come back to visit, because they didn't sell my grandmother's house right away, so there were relatives living in there, and we would visit them. And so I didn't remember the Lyric, but my uncles and my aunts, they talked about the Lyric Theater and the fact that there were long lines, people waiting to get in on weekends, that it was certainly a hot spot. And the fact is, it was in the entertainment area. That's why that is now entertainment district.
Today, the restored Lyric Theater is the home of the Black Archives. Dr. Fields was also instrumental in saving and restoring the home of Dana Albert Dorsey, the first black millionaire in the city of Miami.
I have a copy of the letter from Dana Dorsey Chapman, his daughter, donating it to the Black Archives. The interesting thing about it is that no taxes had been paid on it. So it really wasn't in their family. So really had to get it. The city had to give it to us. In addition to developing the archives, a physical building, I was actively researching. One of the first pioneers that Aunt Roberta Thompson, told me about was Florence Gaskin. My Aunt Roberta said, I think Miss Gaskin's granddaughter is in a retirement home, and she was. I went to visit her, and she had all of her things in a shoebox. That was one of the moments when I realized that this was something bigger than I could ever be. And I was waiting for you all to come. I knew you would come. Until we tell our story. And I believe, and I've been thinking about this a lot, I believe that telling our story, recording our story, processing our story, sharing our stories can in fact lead to justice, freedom, and healing.